At 3:18 in the morning, the sky over Minneapolis changed color. Not gradually, not like an ordinary storm front pushing in from the west. One moment the city was dark in the usual way cities are dark. Street lamps glowing over wet asphalt, delivery trucks on the interstate, one or two apartment windows still lit, someone in a duplex kitchen making coffee before an early shift. Then, without warning, the clouds turned bruised red. Lightning flashed low and wide, almost horizontal, as if the sky had torn open from the inside. And then the hail came. It came hard enough to sound like gravel dumped from rooftops, hard enough to punch through greenhouse glass, dent pickup hoods, crack windshields, shred gutters, and drive people out of bed before they even understood what they were hearing. In the northern suburbs, branches came down across power lines. South of the river, sirens sounded too late for some families to do much more than huddle in hallways and listen. By daylight, the damage stretched beyond the city, into St. Paul, then farther east toward Eau Claire, then south in scattered bursts across the upper Midwest, as if something unstable had broken loose over a much larger map. Meteorologists called it an extreme convective event. That was not wrong, but it was not enough. Because this was late March. In that part of the country, people expect slush, mud, thawing yards, maybe one last stubborn cold snap. They do not expect egg-sized hail before dawn, or red lightning over church steeples, or roof shingles scattered across yards that still held traces of winter. Older residents said they had never seen spring begin that way. Insurance adjusters worked through the morning. Utility crews followed. The National Weather Service issued the usual explanations. Yet the emotional fact remained heavier than the scientific one. Something had happened out of season, out of rhythm, and deep out of place. That same day, in a farmhouse library outside Dubuque, a retired preacher and amateur weather diarist named Caleb Hawthorne reopened a notebook he had not touched in years. And on one of the pages, written in a careful hand long before anyone in Minneapolis heard hail on their roof, was a line that would not leave him alone. When spring comes armed, do not ask only what the sky is doing. Ask what age you are living in. For generations, people in the Midwest trusted a certain order. Winter overstayed, spring struggled in, rivers swelled, fields softened, and baseball returned, and thunderstorms waited their turn until the air turned properly warm. Even those who never thought in poetic terms still lived by inherited patterns. Gardeners watched the ground. Farmers watched the sky. Parents kept snow boots by the mudroom and believed, with reason, that the seasons still obeyed recognizable boundaries. That is why the March hailstorm felt wrong in a deeper way than ordinary damage. It was not just expensive. It was offensive to memory. Over the next 48 hours, scattered reports came in from southern Wisconsin, parts of Iowa, and western Illinois. Not one continuous catastrophe, but a chain of disturbances. Violent wind, lightning bursts, hard hail, local flash flooding, brief funnel rotation, then sudden calm. Newsrooms covered the practical side: property loss, hospital visits, on road closures, insurance claims. Scientists pointed to unstable air masses, temperature anomalies, moisture inflow, and the growing volatility of a warming atmosphere. All of that made sense. In fact, it had to be part of the story. No serious adult should abandon science when the atmosphere turns dangerous. But the source of fear was not scientific confusion. It was moral disorientation, because most people can handle bad weather. What unsettles them is the sense that familiar systems, seasonal, civic, spiritual, emotional, are no longer operating in a way their instincts can trust. Caleb Hawthorne understood that. He was not one of those men who rejected science for symbolism. He had spent years reading forecasts, logging storms, and clipping NOAA bulletins into binders. Yet he had also spent enough time with old sermons, regional folklore, and forgotten prophecy texts to recognize another truth. Human beings do not live by data alone. They live by patterns. And when patterns begin breaking too early, too violently, And too often, societies start reaching for deeper language. That was what made Hawthorne return to his notebooks. Not because he thought he had found a supernatural calendar hidden in thunderclouds, but because something in him recognized the shape of the warning. He had long believed that the most dangerous years were not the years when disaster began, but the years when disaster stopped feeling unusual. And 2026, he feared, might become exactly that kind of year. By the first week of April, television experts had settled into a familiar tone. Calm, technical, reassuring, but not dismissive. They spoke about atmosphere instability, a lingering cold aloft, unseasonably strong heat gradients, saturated lower layers, and the increasing tendency of spring systems to behave like summer violence. The language was disciplined, necessary even. It prevented panic. It gave the public a framework, and in one sense, it told the truth. But it told only one kind of truth, because climate disruption is not just physical. It is civilizational. When people in Minneapolis, Madison, and Rockford start looking at a March sky with June fear, something more than weather has changed. It enters the nervous system. Farmers hesitate before planting. School districts revise storm protocols. Insurance premiums jump. Families who were already stretched by groceries and fuel now add roof repair, car damage, or an ER bill to the list of things they cannot afford to ignore. Yeah, a freak event becomes a budget event. Then a budget event becomes a marriage event. Then it becomes a spiritual event. Not in a mystical sense at first, but in the plain American sense of people asking, quietly and in private, what is happening to the world? That was where Caleb Hawthorne's old notebooks became harder to dismiss. In the 1980s, long before climate anxiety became a marketable phrase, Hawthorne had copied down a cluster of ideas from frontier revival preachers, weather watchers, and one obscure Midwestern mystic named Elias Boone. Boone had written that in the late age of a civilization, the seasons begin to lie. Spring carries winter's weapons. Summer carries flood. Autumn carries fever. The normal order does not disappear overnight. It breaks by misplacement. Things arrive in the wrong month, at the wrong force, and in the wrong moral atmosphere. Was that prophecy? Or simply an old man's way of describing system collapse before modern language existed to explain it? That question matters because responsible people should resist easy mysticism. Yet they should also resist a colder error, the belief that all reality can be understood without meaning. Scientific models can explain hail formation. They cannot tell a nation what it feels like when trust in ordinary rhythm begins to fail. And by late spring, if Hawthorne was right, hail would be remembered not as the main event, but as the first knock on the door. The old notebooks did not say the year would remain cold. They said it would reverse brutally. After the strange storms, after the misplaced ice, after the violent spring sky, Hawthorne expected heat. Not ordinary American summer heat, but prolonged, punishing heat that would make whole regions feel judged rather than merely warmed. He circled Kansas, Nebraska, western Missouri, the Texas Panhandle, eastern Colorado, parts of Arizona, and the lower Mississippi corridor. Not because he claimed secret access to weather maps, but because he believed a season of imbalance always seeks a second form. If spring came armed with hail, summer would come with thirst, and by June, that possibility no longer sounded dramatic. Reservoir conversations returned. Farmers watched topsoil dry too fast. Cattle operators tracked pasture stress. Grid managers used increasingly careful language around demand. In Phoenix and Las Vegas, the conversation was familiar but newly brittle. In Kansas City and Tulsa, the fear sounded different. It was less about another hot summer and more about accumulation. One more season of strain layered over old strain. One more year of unstable insurance, unstable planting, unstable utility cost, unstable confidence. American life does not usually break from a single event. It breaks from linked shocks. That was Hawthorne's core idea. Cause, then consequence, then reversal. He believed the atmosphere in 2026 would behave like a courtroom, not a machine. First the warning, then the pressure, then the escalation. Whether one accepted his spiritual language or not, the pattern itself was difficult to ignore. Heat does not only dry rivers and brown fields, it narrows patience. It increases cost. It agitates populations. It leaves families sleeping poorly and thinking badly. It can turn social tension into ambient weather. That is why some of the old preachers described prolonged heat as a moral amplifier.
Sir, would you like
Not
some
because
water?
temperature creates sin,
Yes, thank you.
but because
It's so
strain
hot.
exposes what comfort
This
had
is
been
a
hiding.
godsend. Thank you.
Still, there was a fair objection. America has always known extremes. Drought is not revelation. Heat waves are not prophecy. True, but 2026 in this story was dangerous not because any one event was unprecedented. It was dangerous
Good
because the
afternoon.
sequence
We're
itself
seeing
felt
elevated
maliciously
heat
timed.
stress across the
Out-of-season
Mediterranean
hail
waterfalls.
followed by relentless
This
heat
attachment
does
into
more
rights
than
blanket
damage
danger
crops.
qualifiers.
It damages the public
Precautions.
sense
Stay
that the world is
hydrated
still
and check
operating
on
inside
vulnerable
recognizable
neighbors.
limits. And once enough people lose that feeling, the next event lands harder than it otherwise would have. Hawthorne knew that too, which was why, in his notes, drought never came alone. It always ended in flood. The human mind can survive a single logic. It struggles when reality begins contradicting itself. That is why the next phase in Hawthorne's notebooks was more frightening than the heat. He believed the danger of late 2026 would not come from drought alone, but from reversal so violent it would feel like mockery. The ground would harden, split, and fail to absorb. Reservoir fear would deepen. Crops would weaken. People would pray for rain. Then, just as the desire for relief became collective, the sky would change its mind too fast. Not gentle rain. Not the kind that settles dust and saves gardens. A black wall atmosphere, pressure drops, tornadic rotation, hail inside summer systems, then water all at once. Americans in different regions know pieces of this pattern already. The plains know the supercell. Appalachia knows the flash flood. California knows the whiplash between drought and deluge. The Gulf knows what happens when warm water feeds violence. What makes the script darker is not invention, it is convergence. When the land is too dry, the water does not heal it. It runs off, it cuts, it carries debris, it triggers mud, slope failure, bridge washouts, contaminated wells, ruined basements, and the worst possible sentence in modern emergency language. Multiple systems are now failing together. That is the sentence Hawthorne feared. He imagined eastern Tennessee hillsides giving way after sudden saturation. He imagined rural roads in western North Carolina vanishing under runoff and rock. He imagined Ozark valleys becoming funnels for water and debris. He imagined county hospitals running short on capacity, not because one city had collapsed, but because too many regions were absorbing linked shocks at once. In American life, when one county suffers, others send help. When too many counties strain together, help becomes mathematics. That is when the psychological break begins. People stop asking what happened. They start asking what comes next and whether anyone is truly in control. Science, once again, can explain much of the mechanism. Soil hydrology, heat domes, atmospheric moisture, convective volatility, land use vulnerability. Every one of those terms matters. But Hawthorne's darker argument remained. When reversals become too frequent and too brutal, people stop experiencing weather as weather. They begin experiencing it as message, not because they are foolish. Because no civilization remains emotionally unchanged when the sky starts behaving like a stranger. And in Hawthorne's view, the worst part of the message was still ahead. Because flood does not only carry water, it carries equality. In times of ordinary uncertainty, wealth creates options. Better contractors, better neighborhoods, stronger roofs, generators, insurance lawyers, private schools, backup funds, safer cars, gated communities. That is part of why affluent societies trust money so deeply. It usually works, or at least it often delays what other people must face sooner. But Hawthorne's notebooks return to one unsettling idea again and again. In linked catastrophe, money does not disappear. It simply stops negotiating on your behalf. A hillside does not ask for a resume before it gives way. A flash flood does not check home values. Large hail does not respect luxury trim packages. When the sequence of 2026 was imagined at its harshest, heat, drought, violent storm, hail, flood, slope collapse, grid failure, blocked roads, interrupted medicine flow, delayed aid. One fact stood out clearly. The old social distances would compress. The man in a gated house and the man in a trailer would both discover how quickly infrastructure becomes more important than status once. Movement, power, and water all become unstable at once. That does not mean suffering becomes equal. It never does. Wealth still buffers. Connections still matter. But under real linked stress, the buffer gets thinner. A mountain road carelessly built beneath unstable soil erases certain illusions very fast. A flooded subdivision makes luxury flooring look comic. A battery dead, signal lost, basement filling, child sick, county overwhelmed. These do not feel like class questions in the moment. They feel like mortality questions. That was central to Hawthorne's warning. He believed America had mistaken private comfort for public resilience. Those are not the same thing. A nation full of impressive houses can still be dangerously weak if its civic tissue is thin, its infrastructure old, its weather unstable, its communities disconnected, and its people morally exhausted. In that kind of system, the wealthy often discover first not that they are poor, but that they are not as protected as they imagined. And the poor discover, cruelly, and that they have been living close to the edge for so long that catastrophe simply arrives sooner and collects faster. This leveling effect haunted Hawthorne more than the storms themselves, because once money loses some of its magic, people start searching for another form of protection. Some search too late. Some search theatrically. Some kneel for the first time in years and try to bargain. And if his notebooks were right, that would be one of the saddest sights of all. There is a kind of spirituality born from reverence, and another born from panic. Hawthorne distrusted the second kind deeply. He had seen it in drought years, in wartime, in addiction funerals, in hospital waiting rooms, in the hollow voice of public men who suddenly discovered religious vocabulary when consequences arrived. It was not that he thought fear invalidated prayer. Fear is human. He thought last-minute bargaining revealed something harsher. How many people had confused delay with immunity? That theme runs through the darker American religious tradition as powerfully as through the source text you shared. The idea is not that God is cruel. It is that reality does not suspend itself simply because the frightened finally become sincere. If a society spends decades consuming without restraint, building without humility, discarding memory, worshiping appetite, ignoring stewardship, and mistaking technological cleverness for wisdom, then when the correction comes, the correction is not bribed away by sudden emotional promises.
I know, sweetie.
Storm shelters matter. Emergency kits matter. Official alerts matter. But no nation should flatter itself that a lifetime of civic laziness can be reversed by one weekend of panic buying and one dramatic moment of televised prayer. Hawthorne believed 2026 would expose exactly that illusion. He pictured wealthy suburbs ordering emergency concrete while exhausted counties struggled to clear culverts. He pictured families finally buying radios after years of ignoring local alert systems. He pictured people who had mocked community now depending on church kitchens, volunteer fire departments, and neighbors with chainsaws. In every case, the pattern was the same. People run first to the private tools they still control. Then, when those prove limited, they rediscover the shared institutions they neglected while life felt easy. That rediscovery can be beautiful. It can also be humiliating, because it forces a society to admit what actually kept it alive the whole time. Not image, not noise, not abstract confidence, but practical virtue, competence, local trust, memory, service, restraint, a willingness to build moral and civic reserves before a season of judgment arrives. Hawthorne wrote that catastrophe is a brutal teacher precisely because it reveals what people worshipped when conditions were soft. By the time the sky turns against them, Most of them already know the answer. And that is why his notebooks do not end in spectacle. They turn, very suddenly, toward responsibility. Because if the year 2026 is a test, then the only serious question is not how to predict it. It is how to live through it without becoming smaller, crueler, or spiritually vacant. By late summer in Hawthorne's framework, the question was no longer whether 2026 had become abnormal. The question was what kind of abnormal year it was. A bad weather year, possibly. A climate acceleration year, almost certainly. But he believed the country risked misunderstanding the deeper pattern if it spoke only in technical language. Because what frightened him was not one storm or even one season. It was linkage. An entire year behaving like a chain reaction. Late winter violence in spring, punishing heat in early summer, then reversal, then flood, then public fatigue, then supply strain, then deeper distrust, then a slow realization that normal had become something people were repeating in order to calm themselves, not because it still described reality. That is what made the year feel apocalyptic without requiring fantasy. America is a society built on managed expectation, schedules, forecasts, insurance tables, seasonal assumptions, school calendars, supply timelines, election cycles, commute habits, grocery logistics. Any one system can bend. But when enough of them begin wobbling together, people stop feeling like citizens of a stable order and start feeling like witnesses to one. That shift is spiritually significant even for those who do not use spiritual language. It turns ordinary anxiety into existential unease. Hawthorne sometimes called such periods threshold years, years when history accelerates and older moral debts come due. He did not mean that the universe keeps a ledger in some simplistic way. He meant something more psychologically and socially accurate. Civilizations can postpone consequence for a long time, but not indefinitely. Environmental abuse, moral exhaustion, infrastructure neglect, civic disconnection, contempt for place, contempt for truth, contempt for the weak. Those things accumulate. Eventually, they stop looking like separate issues and begin showing up as one atmosphere. That, he feared, was what 2026 might become. Not the end of the world. Something harder to live through than that phrase usually suggests. The end of denial. And once denial ends, people face a choice. They can become hysterical, selfish, and manipulable. Or they can recover the old disciplines that make harsh years survivable. That is where the notebooks become unexpectedly practical. Because after all the warnings, Hawthorne offered not despair, but instruction. Hawthorne was not an alarm merchant, he was a man of lists. That is why the closing sections of his notebooks feel less like prophecy and more like field guidance for a republic under strain. He urged people to do two things at once and to treat both as serious. Prepare materially and prepare morally. Not one instead of the other. Both, because material preparation without character creates hoarding. Character without practical readiness creates helplessness. A mature society needs steadiness in both hands. The material side was plain. Pay attention to official forecasts, respect county alerts, evacuation guidance, and utility warnings. Reinforce what needs reinforcing before the season turns. Keep radios, medicine, batteries, water, and documents ready. Know where your nearest shelter options are. Know which relative lives on safer ground. Know which road floods first. Do not treat weather as entertainment. Do not assume your county will be spared because it was spared before. These are not acts of panic. They are acts of respect toward a world that no longer owes you predictability. But the moral side mattered just as much to him. He wrote that fear becomes more dangerous when people are spiritually underfed. So he urged families to restore practices that modern life had treated as decorative. Shared meals, prayer if they prayed, silence if they did not. Real conversation, truth without performance, help for neighbors before catastrophe forced it, and a renewed sense that local community is not sentimental. It is survival architecture. He believed children should be taught not only how storms form, but how character forms. Not only where to shelter, But how to stay human when strain exposes the ugliest impulses in others? This was where Hawthorne's American voice grew strongest. He did not ask people to become mystics. He asked them to become trustworthy, reliable fathers, attentive mothers, competent teenagers, neighborly households, towns that still know how to open the church basement, run the volunteer fire station, feed the school gym shelter, clear the road, share information honestly, and keep frightened people from becoming cruel. In his view, a nation survives linked disaster not because every storm misses, but because enough people remain difficult to corrupt by fear. That was his final preparation. Not predicting every impact point, building the kind of inner and civic life that still functions when prediction fails. And that, finally, is where the year points beyond weather. Toward judgment, yes, but also toward renewal. If the old notebooks matter, they matter for one reason. Not because they prove anyone can outguess the atmosphere. Not because they offer theatrical certainty. But because they ask a question modern people work very hard to avoid. What in us has become too weak for a hard year? That is the real meaning of the story you gave me, and that is what an American audience should hear beneath all the thunder. The hail over Minneapolis, the strange violence of March, the summer heat, the reversal into flood, the fear that 2026 may carry more linked disruption than recent years have trained us to handle. All of that can be read at several levels: meteorological, economic, civic, psychological, spiritual. A mature nation is capable of holding all of them at once. Science tells us how systems destabilize. Experience tells us how households absorb the cost. Older wisdom asks why civilizations wait so long to change. Hawthorne's answer was severe, but not hopeless. He believed harsh years strip away lies faster than calm years do. They reveal who prepared, who performed, who hoarded, who served, who listened, who remembered, and who waited too long. In that sense, a threshold year is not only a punishment, it is a sorting, not between perfect people and evil people. Life is more complicated than that, but between ways of living. One way depends on spectacle, denial, appetite, and borrowed stability. The other depends on memory, discipline, mercy, preparedness, and truth. That second way is slower, less glamorous, less profitable, and far more likely to endure. So if 2026 becomes the kind of year Hawthorne feared, the deepest question will not be whether every warning came true exactly as written. The deeper question will be whether families, towns, and ordinary citizens can still recover the habits that make a republic worth preserving when ease begins to fail. That is not merely a survival question, it is a moral one. And that is where I will leave this story. If it stayed with you, subscribe to the channel, write your thoughts in the comments, and share this video with someone who still believes difficult years can reveal, rather than destroy, what is strongest in a people.